The US using small-scale teams of special forces in West Africa, helping countries including Niger and Nigeria in the fight against Boko Haram. Will the strategy work? Can it be used elsewhere? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. In the past 2 years, Boko Haram has orchestrated a campaign of bombings, assassinations and abductions in Nigeria and nearby countries. Well, the results have been devastating. Children and women increasingly used in suicide attacks, often without even knowing. In neighbouring Niger now, US President Barack Obama is conducting what you could call an experiment. It's part of his government's so-called counter-terrorism strategy. It involves a small team of US Special Operations Forces. Now, these guys don't wear any uniforms, they don't enter into combat. Instead, they focus on finding local partners willing to fight. And they work out ways to stop young people from being recruited in the first place. Boko Haram is fighting against what it calls Western influence. The armed group has expanded across northern Nigeria since it was formed 13 years ago. Its fighters have regularly escaped capture by crossing the border into Niger. They've also been using it as a source of supplies. And Boko Haram has been recruiting young men from border villages like those in Diffa since the late 2000s with the promise of money and adventure. So is the low-risk strategy starting to work in Niger? Could it be applied to other conflicts? Well, let's bring in our guests and hear their thoughts on this. In Washington, D.C., we have Richard Weitz, Senior Fellow and Director at the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. In Cape Town, joining us on Skype, Ryan Cummings, Chief Analyst for the South African think tank Red 24. And also in Washington, Jason Fritz, Senior Researcher at Valens Global, a consulting firm focusing on the challenges posed by violent non-state actors. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Richard, how much do we know of what exactly US Special Forces are doing in places like Niger?
We know some. They're clear both from general statements, administration, reports to Congress, and from media commentary. So stepping back, there's this broad U.S. strategy in Africa of trying to promote stability, filling potential security vacuums, promoting strong but democratic and human rights respecting governments, and countering terrorism. And in that context, the administration has a rich portfolio of tools it's using, diplomatic, economic, and so on, to include military. But there's not large-scale U.S. military deployments in the region, and there's no desire to place them there. The U.S. is instead relying on small groups of specially trained U.S. forces in several places, including Niger and neighboring areas where there's the active Boko Haram insurgency. And in Niger, what they're doing is trying to develop good contacts with local people, help them address some civil construction issues, provide some security in which not directly so much as helping strengthen the local forces, which is part of the administration's broader strategy, and basically allowing the Nigers, empowering them to address the threat themselves with the U.S. in the backstop, and hence this wall, but that's just one small component of it.
Interesting. Jason, military intervention often starts, doesn't it, with the deployment of smaller numbers of foreign forces. How is this strategy different?
Well, looking back in the history of the use of U.S. Special Forces and Special Operations Forces, this is not that different. It's been used even in Africa recently against the Lord's Resistance Army. And this technique of using small teams to go in and support local militaries has been going, it extends back to the 1960s.
All right. I guess there's a question here, Ryan. Is it working if it's not entirely new? Is it leading to some success in fighting Boko Haram?
Well, I think the key issue is that it's still very in its infantile stage, if we can call it that. And again, it's the efficacy of this counter-insurgency strategy we're only likely to probably see in the coming months, if not the coming years, because I don't think that the Boko Haram insurgency is going to be an issue that is going to be responded to anytime soon. But I think the important issue at hand is the focus on not just addressing the insurgency or the militancy threat at the time, but creating the necessary infrastructure and also good governance to ensure that even if the insurgency is addressed and the fighters are defeated and captured or possibly even reintegrated within their communities, that there are the processes in place to ensure that militancy within the region doesn't rear its head again. And I think that this is the focus of this current counterterrorism strategy by the United States, is not just to look at providing a military solution to these insurgencies, but to also put in the requisite structures in place to ensure that these issues...
Is that actually happening, Ryan? Give us, I understand you're familiar with the situation on the ground there in Niger. Give us an idea of what is actually changing when it comes to some of the structures that you're talking about.
Well, I don't think we've necessarily seen a discernible change in any structures yet, because I think a lot of these issues still need to be rolled out quite comprehensively. But speaking to the Boko Haram insurgency in itself, I think if we look at the region, northeastern Nigeria, southeastern Niger, southwestern Chad, and also the far north region of Cameroon, a lot of similarities and parallels can be drawn between those regions. Very weak state institutions exist, high levels of poverty, very low levels of economic development. And basically, it's these socioeconomic factors which have forced many individuals to take up arms to fight for Boko Haram, because often enough, it's a case of survival, basically being able to be provided with money, being able to provide with weaponry it allows one to provide for yourself, provide for your family, in the absence of such support coming from your respective government and administration.
Jason, from what we understand of the strategy here, will it end with more special forces, more US troops being deployed, or is this operation supposed to stay a very slim one?
I expect that the administration would prefer that it stays a slim mission, so that there's not a major escalation to the point where we would see something like in Vietnam, where there was just a continual escalation. But it started with a number of small teams that were advising the local military. I think that a lot of that's going to depend upon how successful the Nigerian military will be against Boko Haram. They have not had a great track record in the northern and even central parts of Nigeria. And in fact, Boko Haram gets many of its weapons from the discarded weapons of the Nigerian army. So if these small teams are able to provide the training that the Nigerian army needs, probably particularly in leadership, and to stay and fight against Boko Haram, I think we could see that they will maintain a small presence.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Richard, how much of the focus of this team is on training the national militaries of other countries, and how much is on building structures within local communities that can keep Boko Haram out?
Well, they're related in that both of them are designed to provide local obstacles to insurgents and extremists, whether they be fixed edifices like the wall, or reinforced settlements, or training of local forces. And there's also provision of economic aid, trying to strengthen the government, root out corruption, address some of the grievances of minorities and so on. So it's all part of our comprehensive strategy. The main weakness or vulnerability of the strategy is it depends a lot on having a good local partner. And that is often not the case in Afghanistan, for example, in Syria now, in Iraq. None of these partners are particularly effective. And so whatever the U.S. tries to do in this area doesn't appear to have much impact. Whereas in Africa, it's worked in some cases, not worked in others. It worked well in Europe in earlier times. So it depends, but you really do need to have a good local partner.
Does the U.S. have a good local partner in Niger, for example? How much good sentiment is there amongst the people level?
Not clear. According to media reports, they do have a good partner. That unlike in Nigeria, which there are other problems besides the ones we just mentioned, in Niger, the government appears to be more effective, appears to have the right approach to this, appears to have trying to work very closely with the U.S., and it would seem to be successful. The other dimension of this is the U.S. and others are trying to get the governments to cooperate among themselves, because terrorists in its modern form is a transnational phenomenon, particularly Boko Haram. They will exploit. There's one of those neighboring countries that's weak and vulnerable, that terrorists will flood in there, establish logistics bases, and so on. So the U.S. has got to get them all to cooperate, and that's why even if Nigeria is very cooperative, Nigeria or some other is not doing well, then that limits the effectiveness of the strategy. We see this, for example, in Afghanistan with the problem with Pakistan.
All right. Ryan, this is what's being reported. It's being said that the number of Boko Haram attacks in Niger have dropped this year. Is that true? And is it because of the work of the U.S. Special Forces?
I would strongly disagree with that statement. Boko Haram's activity in Niger, specifically within the southeastern Difa regions, where these U.S. Special Forces are operating, but also in the neighboring Zinda regions, the activity there was limited to training and recruitment. We saw, for example, in 2011 and also in 2013, there were Boko Haram arrests that were made in the Difa region. There was the claims that there was a training camp that was uncovered, but there were no specific attacks by the group actually targeting either civilian or government interests within Niger. Following the basically the establishment or at least the commencement of regionally coordinated counterinsurgency operations against the militant group, which only really kicked off in January 2015 and which was spearheaded by Nigeria and Chad, but also, as we saw, was provided both logistical and operational support from Cameroon and also Niger. Then is when the Boko Haram violence really regionalized in terms of attacks being reported outside of northeastern Nigeria and northern Cameroon, where a lot of the insurgent activity was primarily taking place. But that is really when we saw an uptick in violence in Boko Haram attacks within Niger and more recently in Chad. So I would say prior to 2015, there hasn't been too many actual acts of violence being perpetrated by Boko Haram within Niger. But after the country started acting from a military capacity against the sect, we've seen these what we can call reprisals to such acts of counterinsurgency operations, which are either being facilitated or supported by the Nigerian army.
Jason, I'd like to get your thought on something as Ryan is talking, what comes to mind is this is a fight against Boko Haram, and we often think of it as a monolithic group. Should there be a strategy perhaps to break up rather than break down Boko Haram? If what we hear sometimes reported in the media that there are up to 6 Boko Haram factions, there's a leadership split between Abu Bakr Shekau and Mohammed Dawood and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a challenge, and there are many aspects that go into considering if we want to try and break up terrorist organizations. I mean, one right now is the possibility that Boko Haram is going through a bit of a restructuring. Recently they've pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, and we're seeing some effects of that in their propaganda, which has become much more glossy and new. But we also don't know how that's affecting them operationally and how that's driving wedges between different leadership of different factions within Boko Haram. The challenges with breaking up, trying to fracture terrorist organizations is you don't know what you end up with later. So if, for instance, the current leadership of Boko Haram is actually the moderate wing of the organization, and we end up fracturing them, deposing that leadership, and someone who's even more extreme steps in, or someone with even bigger ambitions across Africa than they currently have, then we've opened up a bit of a Pandora's box that we didn't intend to. So, it could end up that you could isolate different factions and take them off one by one, but it's very difficult to get an insight into the inside organization of these types of groups and know what the effect of that would be.
Ryan, what attracts people to these factions of Boko Haram? It's been said that elements within some particular ethnic groups, like the Kanuri, are more prone to join Boko Haram. than others? Why? Is it a conviction in the ideology of Boko Haram that's driving people, or are there other tribal and ethnic rivalries and factors at play here?
I think the first issue that we need to note is that we do know very little about Boko Haram, its internal structures, how it actually goes about in its recruitment. And I think there is evidence to obviously provide greater insight on this, but by all means, it's not definitive. I think we can look at four main themes in terms of how the group garners support, or at least recruits. The ethnic dynamic that you just mentioned is quite significant. There's suggestions that Boko Haram is often postured either by the media or by itself as being a Islamist jihadist group, in the same mold as Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, which is one of the larger organizations in sub-Saharan Africa. But Boko Haram may be more of an ethnically oriented group, basically presenting the interests of a specific community which resides within that Lake Chad Basin region, as I earlier mentioned, northeastern Nigeria, southeastern Niger, southwestern Chad, and then northern Cameroon. And that's the Kanuri community. And if Boko Haram is indeed primarily recruiting amongst this community and almost being used as a mechanism for furthering their interests, then there would be that ethnic conviction for members of the Kanuri community to join the group. But I think purely framing Boko Haram as also being a tribal movement is in itself somewhat disingenuous. If we look at the other ways that the group has gone about its recruitment, we see that it does take advantage of the poor socioeconomic circumstances within the regions where it operates. The Lake Chad specifically has had some issues with dwindling water levels within the lake itself. This has decimated the local fishing industry. Many individuals are now without work. We see also in neighboring Niger, for example, where the local pepper trade is the most obvious form of industry. It's also recently been decimated by environmental conditions, and again, a lot of people have been left without work. And what Boko Haram does is it not only offers, access to weaponry, but it also pays a lot of its combatants. And this just gives a more economic incentive for many individuals to join the group, specifically where governments have not stepped up into providing some form of economic subsistence, or try to almost develop other industries to ensure that individuals have greater access to employment within the area, and therefore are able to take care of themselves and their families. A third recruitment stream for Boko Haram is forced recruitment. We touched on the mass kidnappings earlier on in the show, and I think that that's an issue to also touch on, is that Boko Haram does kidnap a lot of individuals and use them in some form of operational capacity for the group. It might be limited to providing services within Boko Haram camps, but in many cases we do believe that there has been some individuals, I should say, have been used in a combative role. Yeah, that is based.
Let me bring Richard into this. Poor, perhaps, socioeconomic situation there, ethnic rivalries. Obviously, the situation is different in places like Niger than in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, but there does seem to be, on some level, some similarities, shall we say. Why is this strategy being seen as more successful against Boko Haram than it has been seen in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and so on?
Okay, just a big caveat that social science research is not definitive about causes of terrorism. It's not necessarily clear that poverty or sectarian divisions or any of these factors we think of as definitively linked with terrorism. It's obviously more complicated than that. But I think
if we get into terrorism, of course, what is terrorism and who's the terrorist? That will take up a few shows, won't it, Richard?
Right, yes. But their question's a good one, and I think I come back to my earlier point that you often need to have a really good local partner to make this work. So U.S. and Vietnam didn't work because we had to deal with the South Vietnamese government. It was just exploiting and corrupt. Afghanistan, we go through many problems. Even still, despite Karzai's leaving and some improvements, there's still just a bunch of problems there. And Syria, as we've discussed before, there's no local ally the U.S. can work with. In Iraq, the Kurds seem to be most successful at partnering with the U.S., but of course they're just a small minority, and there's complications with Turkey and so on if you work with the Kurds. So really you need a good local partner, and you may also need a good regional context. I mean, it helps if you can, as in Europe, when the U.S. was able to defeat some of the communist subversion attempts in the 1940s, it had a good partnership with local leaders, not just in the country under threat, but throughout the region. And that may be true in parts of Africa. But in the Middle East, we all know the problems the U.S. has is getting good partners locally and regionally.
All right. Jason, is something being learnt here that can be replicated elsewhere from the U.S. perspective? Might it become a model for how the U.S. approaches other conflicts?
Yeah, I suspect it would, as long as there's some semblance of success. As we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was a little less successful to have, to say the least, massive amounts of forces conducting counterinsurgency operations. And I think part of the problem, and just kind of compounding what Richard was saying, that when the insurgencies begin, that they're a complaint against the government, and then when the U.S. steps in with a massive presence, then the U.S. becomes the problem, at least amongst the locals who see the U.S. as exerting some imperial force. A smaller organization, when we're talking scores of people, not thousands, prevent that problem from occurring, and so that you have these small groups, so you don't have the U.S. face on the local government attempting to exert control over its territory. And if it is successful here, we'll probably continue to see it being used across the globe.
What role, I'm curious to know, is there something different here, Ryan, in the role that NGOs like the Spirit of America are playing as part of this military plan compared to the sort of role that reconstruction and community support efforts played in other conflict zones?
It firstly tries to almost surrogate the military presence of a foreign force that may be perceived as being an occupying and imperial force, and almost supports that with providing basic services to communities, which makes the presence there more tolerable, and almost sees foreign forces as being a partner to local communities as opposed to a force that's just there to occupying territory.
But hang on, right? That's precisely what some of the reconstruction efforts were supposed to be focused on in places like Afghanistan. How is the role of community support different when it comes to Niger?
Well, I think it's what Jason had mentioned. It's not a significant force. It's just a handful of individuals. So it doesn't have that pronounced or acute U.S. face to it that could end up allowing the United States as being viewed as being the main problem at hand for local communities, and which could probably, or possibly I should say, help Boko Haram with its local recruitment. So having the small communities, it helps the military, a small military cohort, be able to operate within the region without minimal antagonism. It's seen as a partner to local communities. But I think also within the local context and the local security service and governance structures, what aid agencies are able to do is almost provide them with the know-how and also the acumen to be able to continue to develop these services when they leave, but to also show them how providing basic services to communities actually helps, ensure that there's greater trust between the government and these communities, who then become almost intrinsic in providing the intelligence and the assistance and local support you need to respond to security threats such as Boko Haram.
All right, we're going to have to leave the discussion there. Thank our guests in Cape Town, Ryan Cummings; in Washington, D.C., Jason Fritz and Richard Weitz. And thank you too for watching. You can get in contact with us if you head over to our programme page on our website, aljazeera.com. You can also leave a comment on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team, for now, it's goodbye.